Miss Rettig, who has gone through this every day for months, sits patiently and waits for his fiendish glee to subside, and then reminds him, as she has to do a dozen times a day, that such a number is not yet possible under the company's regulations. She hastily adds that of course it will be possible when Mr. PETTIFOSS finally gets complete charge of the company. Somewhat mollified, PETTIFOSS snarls for a while, but in the end agrees to stay within bounds. He writes down all the tough arrangements of authorized numbers he can think of and tries them out on Miss Rettig. When she stumbles several times, trying to say New Milford 1006W1, he claps his hands and okays the change. It hasn't been such a bad day after all, and Rudwool Yermurm PETTIFOSS goes home in what for him are high spirits to kick his children's rabbits around a while before sitting down to dinner. Backward and Downward with Mr. Punch. Looking for a Roman coin I had dropped on the library floor of the house I rented for the winter, I found on a shelf behind a sofa 24 immense bound volumes of Punch. They contained all the copies of the famous British weekly from the year it was founded until 1891, exactly half a century later. I picked out 3 volumes at random and began idly turning the pages of first one and then another. When the following Tuesday found me still at it, I realized what I was up to. I was getting ready to make some kind of report on Mr. Punch of the 19th century. If it has been done before, all I can say is that I am doing it again. Let us begin, then, with the tome which contains the issues from July 1889 to July 1891, and work our way back toward the Civil War. This volume, like all the others, contains some rather heavy introductory notes summarizing what was going on in the world at the time. In this 2-year period, quite a lot was going on, if you have forgotten. The young and impetuous Kaiser Wilhelm was rattling his saber and already disturbing the peace of mind of Europe. The volume falls open easily at the double page containing Tenniel's famous cartoon, Dropping the Pilot, for it was at this time that Wilhelm got rid of Bismarck. Socialism was raising its troublesome head, so terrifying Mr. Punch that he had Tenniel draw a cartoon of a serpent, socialism, wrapped about the body of an eagle, trade, and striving to crush the bird's wings, capital and labor. The brief, sad romance of Parnell and Captain O'Shea's wife shocked the British Isles and formed a dark foil for the decorous private life of Mr. Gladstone, who, past 80 years old, celebrated his golden wedding anniversary. Tennyson, the poet laureate, became an octogenarian in his turn, and Browning died 2 years short of the mark. A potato famine was predicted in Ireland, and an epidemic of influenza held the world in what I am sure Punch, somewhere or other, must have called its grip. A young pianist, whom Punch laughingly alluded to as a Paddy Revsky from Irish Poland, gave a concert in London, but Punch could not appraise the young man's talents because Punch did not attend the concert. Punch could report, however, that the life in Marion Crawford's latest novel was real life, and that Mr. Ibsen's A Doll's House was unutterably loathsome and should be removed from the stages of the world. The harsh effects on the feminine complexion of that new invention, the electric light, gave Punch 100 whimsical ideas, and so did the new and wonderful Eiffel Tower. One proud London paper wrote, "The Eiffel Tower is 1,000 feet high. The 4th bridge, if stood on end, would be 5,280 feet in height." Mr. Edison's phonograph was received with proper respect, Punch calling up the spirit of Faraday, who solemnly approved of the device. Montana, the Dakotas, and Washington were admitted to the Union, and the government breathed more easily when Sitting Bull was shot dead. Barnum was in London with his great show, and Millet's The Angelus was sold to an American. A hydrophobia scare led to the muzzling of all the dogs in England, and Punch came out for the much-abused Pasteur in a drawing with this dialogue between a husband and wife. "Oh, Joseph, Teddy's just been bitten by a strange dog. Doctor says we'd better take him over to Pasteur at once. But, my love, I've just written and published a violent attack upon Monsieur Pasteur, on the score of his cruelty to rabbits, and at your instigation, too. Oh, heavens, never mind the rabbits now. What are all the rabbits in the world compared to our only child? Among the minor objects of Mr. Punch's annoyance during these years were Mr. Pinero for an attack on the London music halls, newfangled barbed wire fences for interfering with fox hunting, the Americans for coining so much money and so many new words, and Count Tolstoy for a savage assault on tobacco smokers. Of this last, Punch rhymed in part, Tolstoy knew a man who said he cut off a woman's head, but when half the deed was done, lo, the murderer's courage gone, and he finished, 'tis no joke, only by the aid of smoke. Unhorrified by murderers who got a lift from nicotine, Mr. Punch could not approve of the use of the weed by ladies, some of whom were apparently going in for cigars. You're beautiful, but fairer far you'd be if only you would let your male friends smoke that big cigar, and yield them to that cigarette. Most of the jokes in this volume are about bad cooks, worse painters, errant nursemaids, precocious children, insolent cab drivers, and nonchalant young blades in ballrooms. I found, somewhat to my surprise, that a great many of these young blades were named Gus. I found also to my surprise that the expression, I'm nuts on, meaning I'm crazy about, was used in 1891, and that the irate voice from upstairs joke began 50 years ago, unless what I ran across was just a revival of it. Stern voice from first floor landing, Tempus 12:10 p.m. Alice? Alice, softly. Yes, Pa? Voice with threatening ring in it. Does that young man in the front parlor take tea or coffee for his breakfast? Door, and he was gone. During the 80s and 90s, Mr. Henry James, of whom I could find no mention anywhere in Punch, was in the midst of his elaborate and delicate examinations of American ladies abroad, but Mr. Punch lashed out at them in a simpler manner. Sir James. And were you in Rome? American lady. I guess not. To her daughter. Say, Bella, did we visit Rome? Fair daughter. Why, Ma, certainly. Don't you remember? It was in Rome we bought the lisle thread stockings. American lady is convinced. The American male comes in for it, too. Young Britisher. Your father's not with you, then, Miss Van Trump? Fair New York millionairess, one of three. Why, no, Pa's much too vulgar. It's as much as we can do to stand Ma. Sometimes Punch had it our damsels in verse. The American girl. She guesses and she calculates, she wears all sorts of collars, her yellow hair is not without suspicion of a dye. Her papa is a dull old man who turned pork into dollars, but everyone admits that she's indubitably spry. She did Rome in a swift 2 days, gave half the time to Venice, but vows that she saw everything, although in awful haste. She's fond of dancing, but she seems to fight shy of lawn tennis, because it might endanger the proportions of her waist. Her manner might be well defined as elegantly skittish. She loves a lord as only a republican can do. And quite the best of titles, she's persuaded, are the British. And well she knows the peerage, for she's read it through and through. She's bediamonded superbly and shines like a constellation. You scarce can see her fingers for the multitude of rings. She's just a shade too conscious, as it seems, of admiration, with irritating tendencies to wriggle when she sings. She owns she is American, and her accent is alarming. Her birthplace is an awful name you pray you may forget. Yet after all, we own La Belle Américaine is charming, so let us hope she'll win at last her long-sought coronet. Phil May, the great caricaturist, came back to London in the early 90s after a long stay in Australia, but his work does not appear in this volume. It could have used some. Before I leave this engrossing period of history and humor, I must quote a typical foreigner in the English home joke. This one, with its evidence of the 19th century Englishman's fine ear for the German accent, is my favorite of several hundred. Hostess. Won't you try some of that jelly, Herr Silbermund? Herr Silbermund, who has just been helped to pudding. Ach, thank you no. I would rather pair with the ills we have than fly to others we know not of. In the years 1869 to 1871, our second volume, Mr. Punch had a wealth of subjects for his little punning pieces and his big political posters. The Fenians in Ireland and America were raising hell on behalf of the freedom of Erin, and the Alabama claims case was still a sore point between England and America. Harriet Beecher Stowe, having freed the slaves, nosed about in the private life of the late Lord Byron, and provided the great scandal of the day in a magazine article revealing the love story of the poet and his half-sister, Augusta Lee. General Dan Sickles, hero of the peach orchard at Gettysburg, who was god-damning up and down the American Chancellery in Madrid as our ambassador, informed his government that the Spaniards were sore about our friendly attitude toward the Cuban insurrectionists, and might do something about it. On the 18th of July, 1870, the infallibility of the Pope was declared. On the next day, France declared war on Prussia, and rushed headlong to defeat, the French mitrailleuse proving less deadly than the Prussian needle gun. Disraeli published a novel called Lothair, and made Bartlett's quotations with a crack about critics being people who have failed in literature and the arts. Oxford beat Harvard in the first crew race ever rowed between the two universities, and a small, resolute band of women began to clamor for the right to vote. Darwin's The Descent of Man was pie for the wits of Punch, and the magazine cried out against the deplorable fact that the word reliable, which it described as a new and unnecessary American adjective, was creeping into the inviolable English tongue. On top of everything, the women of England were affecting the Grecian bend, which Punch called an exaggerated forward inclination of the body, an absurd fashion of the hour. I devoted a great deal of my research to hunting down 70-year-old versions of jokes which are still going the rounds, and I offer my most cherished discovery. The Curate. Oh dear, drunk again, Jones, drunk again, and in broad daylight, too. Jones. Lorsh, hic, what's the odds? So am I. You will remember this one, too. Ticket collector. Now then, make haste. Where's your ticket? Bandsman, refreshed. I've lost it. Ticket collector. Nonsense. Feel in your pockets. You cannot have lost it. Bandsman. I cannot? Why, man, I've lost the big drum. Throughout this volume, there runs a series of drawings of cute kiddies above the most distressingly cute captions. If the researcher rapidly tires of the pen and ink drawings of the famous Georges-Louis Paméa Buisson du Maurier, the gentle, graceful satirist of modern fashionable life, it is perhaps mainly because of the gags he is given to illustrate. I select the ickiest of them. A mother is about to give a dose of medicine to a 2-year-old girl. Master George whispers, I say, Kitty, has Mama been telling you she'd give you a lovely spoonful of delicious currant jelly? Oh, so nice, so very nice. Kitty. Yes, currant jelly. Oh, so nice, so welly nice. Master George. Then don't take it. Du Maurier's husbands and wives are pictured engaged in what are surely the most depressing conversations ever recorded in the history of civilized man. I quote the first, but not necessarily the worst of those I come to in my grim notes. Well, dearest, where have you been tonight? Monday pops again? No, Celia, I have spent a most instructive evening with the Anthropological Society. The how much, darling? The Anthropological, Celia. Are you deaf? How nice. And where do they anthropologe, duckums? I shall end my discussion of this fond old volume with a caption that for its simplicity and point rose out of these fusty yellow pages like a little cool wind. I like to think this is one the author of Trilby thought up himself. It appears under a drawing of a dowager in a carriage drawn by 2 horses and surmounted by a coachman and a footman. The lady has just given alms to a poverty-stricken woman whose ragged children are gathered about her knees. Grateful recipient. Bless you, my lady. May we meet in heaven. Haughty donor. Good gracious. Drive on, Jarvis. It grieves me to report that Punch was unable to let it go at that. In parentheses and italics there follows this explanatory line. She had evidently read Dr. Johnson, who didn't care to meet certain people anywhere, just in case you hadn't caught on. In the year 1863, our third and last volume runs from July 63 to July 65, the newly married Edward and Alexandra were cheered everywhere they went. The great Blondin was walking the tightrope in the Crystal Palace, and a young woman who imitated him at a small-town carnival fell and broke her neck. The Russians were beating up the Poles, and Schleswig-Holstein was the Czechoslovakia of the year, and of the next. Louis Napoleon announced that the improvements brought about by civilization would render war still more destructive. Disraeli said, "The condition of Europe is one of very grave character. Let us be sure, if we go to war, first of all, that it is a necessary and just war." The Japanese killed an Englishman named Richardson and committed a savage assault on an Englishwoman and 2 friends. Garibaldi visited London, and the 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's birthday was celebrated. Punch was irritated by the clamor in the streets caused by organ grinders and hurdy-gurdy men, and hucksters selling watercress and prawns. There is no mention in the volume of what must have been to Punch one of the minor events of the early 60s, the Battle of Gettysburg. Mr. Punch's snipes and jibes at Abraham Lincoln and the cause of the North are too well known to call for an extended examination, but the researcher will cite 2 because he wants to append some notes of his own to them. Instead of habeas corpus in the United States, which has been suspended, it is now, in the case of the prisoner who is arbitrarily arrested, Abe who has corpus. Researchers note, the English government, which was apparently unswayed by Punch, suspended the right of habeas corpus in Ireland in 1866. Latest American Telegrams, 1864. Grant reduced to grunt. Sheridan's rivals successful. Hunter hunted. Pillow on Sherman's rear. Researcher's note. The Encyclopedia Americana on Pillow, Gideon J., American soldier. After 1861, he did not figure in any battle save Murfreesboro, in which he had a courtesy command. Murfreesboro was fought some 20 months before Punch's little crack. You might also be interested in a diatribe printed January 21st, 1865, and headed to the Yankee Braggarts. This American crisis is one which is only to be met by the most unmitigated swagger, and Mr. Punch, hastily constituting himself head swaggerer to the English nation, hereby answers the Yankee journals with shouts as loud and shrieks as fierce as their own. Researcher's note. Somebody had got off some remarks in America about our being able to lick England. War with England, indeed, you long-necked, wizened, ugly, ignorant Occidentals. Defy the flag that has braved 1,000 years the battle in the breeze. Laugh at the lion and give umbrage to the unicorn. Bah! Bosh! Shut up! Tremble! It goes on to say that one Sir Hugh Rose could go over and lick the whole United States. This happened to be the first time I had ever heard of Sir Hugh, but maybe Grant and Lee knew who he was. The end to all this is well known. Tenniel drew a touching cartoon showing Britannia laying a wreath on Lincoln's bier, and Tom Taylor wrote an equally famous and equally touching poem, eating all of Punch's nasty words and all of Tenniel's nasty drawings. This, incidentally, was the year that Alice in Wonderland was published, the book that gave Mr. Tenniel something really important to do. I find no mention of it in Punch. Lincoln and the North might be forgiven, but America's pernicious invention of new words wasn't. If the pure well of English is to remain undefiled, said Mr. Punch, no Yankee should be allowed henceforth to throw mud into it. It is a form of verbal expectoration that is most profane, most detestable. He gives you an idea of what he has in mind a few pages farther on. Two American ladies are pictured at a dance, with a young beau standing by. Says one of the ladies, under the heading, Yet Another Americanism, "Here, Maria, hold my coat while I have a fling with the stranger." American ladies were invariably represented as pretty and well-shaped, in spite of Mr. Punch's purple anger at one Nathaniel Hawthorne, sometime American consul at Liverpool, who had brought out a book about England thoroughly saturated with what seemed ill nature and spite, and making a savage onslaught upon our women. Excerpts are quoted, but I have space for only one. "English girls seem to me all homely alike. They seem to be country lasses of sturdy and wholesome aspect, with coarse-grained, cabbage-rosy cheeks. How unlike the trim little damsels of my native land." Mr. Punch hopes that Mr. Hawthorne will go on to write an autobiography, for Mr. Punch is very partial to essays on the natural history of half-civilized animals. I will close this survey with a typical illustrated joke of those years of pain and sorrow. It is labeled "Gentle Rebuke," and the caption will give you some idea of what the drawing is like. Old Gentleman: "How charmingly that young lady sings. Pray, who composed the beautiful song she has just favored us with?" Lady of the House: "Oh, it is by Mendelssohn." Old Gentleman: "Ah, one of his famous songs without words, I suppose." Moral: Young ladies, when you sing, pronounce your words carefully, and then you will not expose unmusical old gentlemen to making such ridiculous mistakes as the above. Has anybody got any bound copies of old almanacs? The Man Who Hated Moonbaum. After they had passed through the high grilled gate, they walked for almost a quarter of a mile, or so it seemed to Tallman. It was very dark. The air smelled sweet. Now and then leaves brushed against his cheek or forehead. The little stout man he was following had stopped talking, but Tallman could hear him breathing. They walked on for another minute. "How we doing?" Tallman asked finally. "Don't ask me questions," snapped the other man. "Nobody asks me questions. You'll learn." "The hell I will," thought Tallman, pushing through the darkness and the fragrance and the mysterious leaves. "The hell I will, baby. This is the last time you'll ever see me." The knowledge that he was leaving Hollywood within 24 hours gave him a sense of comfort. There was no longer turf or gravel under his feet. There was something that rang flatly, tile or flagstones. The little man began to walk more slowly, and Tallman almost bumped into him. "Can't we have a light?" said Tallman. "There you go!" shouted his guide. "Don't get me screaming! What are you trying to do to me?" "I'm not trying to do anything to you," said Tallman. "I'm trying to find out where we're going." The other man had come to a stop and seemed to be groping around. "First it's the wrong uniforms," he said. "Then it's red fire in Scotland, red fire 300 years ago. I don't know why I ain't crazy." Tallman could make out the other man dimly, a black gesturing blob. "You're doing all right," said Tallman. "Why did I ever leave the brown derby with this guy?" he asked himself. "Why did I ever let him bring me to this house, if he has a house? Who the hell does he think he is?" Tallman looked at his wristwatch. The dial glowed wanly in the immense darkness. He was a little drunk, but he could see that it was 3:30 in the morning. "Not trying to do anything to me, he says," screamed the little man. "Wasn't his fault. It's never anybody's fault. They give me $10,000 worth of Sam Brown belts for Scotch Highlanders, and it's nobody's fault." Tallman was beginning to get his hangover headache. "I want a light," he said. "I want a drink. I want to know where the hell I am." "That's it. Speak out," said the other. "Say what you think. I like a man who knows where he is. We'll get along." "Contact," said Tallman. "Camera, lights. Get out that 100-year-old brandy you were talking about." The response to this was a soft flood of rose-colored radiance. The little man had somehow found a light switch in the dark. God knows where, thought Tallman, probably on a tree. They were in a courtyard paved with enormous flagstones, which fitted together with mosaic perfection. The light revealed the dark stones of a building which looked like the Place de la Concorde side of the Crillon. "Come on, you people," said the little man. Tolman looked behind him, half expecting to see the shadowy forms of Scottish Highlanders, but there was nothing but the shadows of trees and of oddly shaped plants closing in on the courtyard. With a key as small as a dime, the little man opened a door that was 15 feet high and made of wood 6 inches thick. Marble stairs tumbled down like Niagara into a grand canyon of a living room. The steps of the two men sounded sharp and clear on the stairs, died in the soft depths of the immensity of carpet in the living room. The ceiling towered above them. There were highlights on dark wood medallions, on burnished shields, on silver curves and edges. On one wall, a 40-foot tapestry hung from the ceiling to within a few feet of the floor. Tolman was looking at this when his companion grasped his arm. "The second rose," he said. "The second rose from the right." Tolman pulled away. "One of us has got to snap out of this, baby," he said. "How about that brandy?" "Don't interrupt me," shouted his host. "That's what Hooses whispers to what's-his-name. Greatest love story in the world, if I do say so myself. King's wife mixed up in it. Knights riding around with spears. Hooses writes her a message made out of twigs bent together to make words. 'I love you,' sends it floating down a stream past her window. They got her locked in. God-damnedest thing in the history of pictures. Where was I? Oh, second rose from the right," she says. "Why? Because she's seen it twitch. She's seen it move. What's-his-name is bending over her, kissing her maybe. He whirls around and shoots an arrow at the rose. Second from the right, way up high there. Down comes the whole tapestry. Weighs 1,100 pounds, and out rolls this spy, shot through the heart. What's-his-name sent him to watch the lovers." The little man began to pace up and down the deep carpet. Tolman lighted a fresh cigarette from his glowing stub and sat down in an enormous chair. His host came to a stop in front of the chair and shook his finger. "Look," said the little man, "I don't know who you are, and I'm telling you this.